Hey guys, welcome back to Total Tactics Football. It's Fran here, and I'll be kind of looking at my Game Week 6 recap and review. Now, of course, this week wasn't the best. It was kind of similar to last week, where there was a bit of a red arrow once again. But this week is a little bit different because I would say I made the wrong decisions this week, and as opposed to trying to save my team in terms of transfers. I think I made the right decision in terms of transfers. So like going for Sarn, going for a kind of -4 hit to take Saint Maximan, especially due to the fact that he hauled, and of course my alternative would have been Bamford, but just wrong decisions in terms of personnel and the captaincy pick. Of course, I was deciding between someone like Ronaldo as well, and Antonio. Salah wasn't really in my mind, but obviously one of the golden lessons here is Salah seems to be a great captain week on week. Nothing really wrong with that. I've already been bit twice in a sense by not going for Salah. One in terms of game week 2 when Bruno blanked and got a yellow card, and also this week here with Ronaldo with I think a rather poor United performance. Ironically, I think this was the week where I kind of took out Greenwood, but I think he actually had his most kind of interesting game in terms of, let's say, the underlying stats and actually getting many shots on target, which is what you want to see from Greenwood. Um, but what I noticed that he kind of took away a little bit from Ronaldo's shot. So once again, in my mind, as I go into the week ahead, maybe I'm not so confident in going for that kind of hold of Ronaldo over the Everton game. But I do think Everton is a much easier team to actually face than Aston Villa right now. I think the defensive numbers say the same, and even if you want to just look at the head to head, I think clearly I think Aston Villa was a slight step above Everton. At least this kind of formation of Everton with DCL and Richarlison being out, and things like that. So for me, obviously, ultimately not the worst week. I think I made the right transfers. I'm happy with having Sar and Saint Maximan in the short to medium future. I think these are kind of enabler options that will actually allow me to kind of improve my defense. And as you can see, another mistake that I made this week in terms of defense was obviously Cody, right? So Cody was someone who actually managed a very, very good haul. I think watching the Wolves and Southampton game was exactly how I expected it to be. Wolves had a rather poor performance, but actually still managed to back the clean sheet, and that's of course why we saw so many good points for Jose Sa and some other players. So I think from my point of view, a bit of a mistake there, but I think I read the game right in the sense that I think Southampton were going to kind of overwhelm Wolves for the most part. But I think that the difference, of course, is in my calculation, I think, is that Southampton simply don't have the most interesting attackers, and that kind of leads back to my kind of cheat sheet where I don't really particularly rate Armstrong, even if the fixtures are going to go green. I think Southampton is quite interesting in terms of some assets like Livramento, but it's clear that they aren't building consistent attacking opportunities. The strikers aren't getting into the right positions. I saw Armstrong very deep at times trying to get the ball, and a lot of their attack is kind of driven by Gineppo, and ultimately he's not the most efficient of players, and that's not the nicest thing you'd like to see if you're kind of backing a Southampton attack. Conversely, I think Newcastle are actually building a lot of chances. They're just not that clinical, but at least there is the presence of chances. The existence of them means that Saint Maximan is likely going to be there and thereabouts as a talisman. So I really like that. In terms of Jota, I'm actually really happy to still have him in my team. I'm really glad that he hauled, and I think I made the right choice in terms of transferring out Greenwood as an example, due to the fact that I thought Jota had a nicer fixture versus Brentford. And I just liked his positioning more in terms of how many chances he was actually given, compared to Greenwood on a weekly basis, even though he missed the sitter the previous week. I'm almost tempted to keep Jota, for the foreseeable future because I don't really know exactly what is Rafinha's situation. I think Rafinha is the midfielder who I'd like to have in this team, but I'm not 100% confident about whether he's allowed to play or not, or how extensive his injury can be, or whether it can kind of turn for the worse. I think the one kind of tricky spot is obviously, what my transfer is going to be this week. Is it going to be going for Lukaku, maybe going for a hit and going for another Chelsea defender? Marcos Alonso has already, of course, received a price rise, and I think Rudiger is set to have a price rise as well. So we kind of have a look at, some of the price risers this week. We'll kind of see that, or at least the impending price rises. It's probably going to be, Rudiger and Benrahma. I think it's very likely that Benrahma rises, which is nice for me. That's probably slightly more profit for me there. It's going to be a little bit sad with Ramsdale going up as well because he's a keeper I'm looking at, even though I'm not on a wild card. I think if you're going for a wild card, Ramsdale makes a lot of sense. I think he looks really, really good for Arsenal, and given the fact that he was given 3 fixtures in a row and the North London derby, I think you can clearly say that he's got an into Arteta's plans as a more permanent fixture, and I think Leno is pretty much on his way out now of the team. And it's not only just the fact that Ramsdale's making great saves, but he really is kind of enabling that defense in terms of having the comfort, to kind of pass out of the back with your keeper. It was a little bit like, when Kepa was kind of down in confidence, and I think, some of his defenders weren't confident passing with him around the back, and he was a little bit erratic at times. I think Ramsdale's very composed, and he clearly has slid into this role really well. In terms of the rest of the team, I think when we look at or the kind of price fall situations, I think, Leon Bailey continuing to drop is quite interesting because I do think he can be a talismanic player for Aston Villa. So as he continues to drop with the injury concerns, I think he could be an interesting asset to pick up when Villa's fixture kind of turns slightly better. Nothing else too crazy, I think, on that front. Reguilon probably going to hit an impending price fall, which is reasonable because I think Spurs simply look like one of the worst teams in the league. I think it's just clearly the midfield and the balance not being kind of gotten right by Nuno. I think that could improve over time, but at the same time, it's not promising that he's kind of implementing a sort of long ball approach. And I think I'm worried about going for assets like Son and Kane who would deeply benefit from that. And I think on that basis, there's a very good argument now to say there's no real reason to have any kind of big talismanic midfielders apart from Salah. At this point in time, because I think with maybe exception to someone like Grealish and Jota, really most of the interesting midfielders are actually playing in those kind of mid-table teams and are talismans for those teams. And I was really glad to see Gallagher hold as well. I think Gallagher's super interesting in terms of players who are looking for a wild card or some sort of midfield switch up, and an enabler in that sense. So I think really glad that he hauled as well. I think overall, in terms of my general plans, as I say, it's probably still going to Chelsea players. I know they had a bad game versus Man City, but you have to kind of look at an approach where, simply put, they're not going to be facing Man City for the next few matches in the league, and you're going to be happy to have these Chelsea players, during that kind of fixture run, compared to some of the other players that you could have in other options. So I think when you, for example, compare the prices of, let's say, players like Cresswell or Soufal, being quite high up there in the 5+ range, simply put, I think the added benefit of having a stronger defense this year is very paramount, especially with the fact that we can have very kind of well-priced budget mids. So I think my general plan, I think maybe in the future as well, is to probably dip into these Man City defenders probably in the subsequent week. Whether or not I kind of double up on Man City defense is a different question. I think it's an interesting question as well because some people could also rightly raise the point that maybe a double Man City defense still makes sense over the course of the season as opposed to a double Chelsea defense, right, over the nice fixture run. But I still think that there's dividends to be paid for going Chelsea at least for the next 5-6 fixtures, and then maybe switching out of one of your Chelsea defenders so you can double up the Man City defense in the future. I think in terms of the midfield, the nice thing is that we have a lot of options. So between Gray, Rafinha, Gallagher, Benrahma, and Sarr, I think you have plenty of options, and of course there's some more differentials in there, but that's the nice thing. I think there's a lot of balance that can be created with these players, and I think with the forwards, it was nice to see Jimenez actually haul, but I would still say that I think some of his decision makings or decisions were very poor in the week. Watching him kind of scuff the kind of pass opportunity to Traore, which would have allowed for Traore to finally get his first FPL haul, was a little bit disheartening. But I think he pretty much just beat Southampton on a one-on-one basis. So it wasn't really the case that Southampton's defense is extremely poor. You could argue that their defenders or the players playing in those defensive positions, like Romeo, for example, were kind of manhandled by Jimenez. But I don't think those chances will kind of come very often for Jimenez. I think that was a little bit of a gift, if I'm being honest, and kind of Southampton being collapsed by a long ball. But it remains to be seen, I think, whether or not there are more interesting forward options, especially with maybe Bamford and DCL returning in the near future. But as it stands, I think it makes sense to have, one of those cheaper midfielders or cheaper strikers, like saying Maximan or even Tony for this moment in time, because when you go past game week at 10, I think Tony becomes a fantastic value asset. Even Mbeumo, to be honest, becomes extremely interesting as an asset. I think it was nice to also see that Brentford could lose their clean sheet, and that a big team and a big side can penetrate versus them with the right creativeness, which also kind of, I think, also strengthens potentially, that Lukaku pick. So that's a nice little thing that I saw today, or rather over the game week. But I think my general observations are, once again, to kind of stick with the plan to go with Chelsea players. I'm not going to be swayed by that Man City game too much. We know this side is very resilient and very deep. And I think the only thing that makes sense is probably not to kind of knee jerk into a transfer, but rather to wait for the Champions League, because we know, an injury can happen or something crazy can happen. So I think it just makes sense to practice a little bit of patience in terms of when you make that transfer. I know price rises, people want to capitalize on them, but I think Given the fact that, of course, I have such a large budget right now at 3.4 mil. When we look at the transfers, I think it makes sense for me to kind of wait and see if there's kind of interesting opportunities or rather kind of situations that I have to kind of respond to. But that's it for me for now for this kind of game week review. I hope you guys have had a lovely week. Ultimately, I'm still in the top 20K, which I'm very happy about. But of course, I'd like to do better. So let's hope next week is a much better one. Of course, it's going to be a tough one because I have a triple up of Liverpool, and maybe the answer might be to go out of Jota, even though he looks so good still. Probably not going to do that, to be honest. I think that would be quite a risk. But for the most part, I'll see you guys soon.